Thank you very much, Jack. My talk this afternoon is about the ethical foundations of radiological protection system. ICRP has established a task group regarding this topic. And today's my presentation is the summary of the work that have been done so far by the task group. At the outset, I will briefly introduce the task group 94 and provide you the outline and background of the TG94 draft report and the major contents of the currently available version of the draft report, such as core ethical values underpinning the system, as well as the ethics in the implementation of the system. TG94 was created with the mandate of developing an ICRP publication which elicits and makes it clear what are the ethical principles and values underlying the ICRP system of radiological protection. This is to clarify the rationale for the ICRP recommendations and also to assist in discussions related to its practical implementation. For this purpose, three major tasks are defined in the terms of reference for TG94, and they are first to identify the key components of the ethical theories and principles. Second, to review all ICRP publications to identify the ethical values associated with the system. And finally, to prepare a report. There are 10 full members and 3 corresponding members in TG94, and they are radiation protection specialists and ethicists in various areas, including biomedical ethics and environmental ethics. From August 2013, a series of workshops was organized by ICRP in collaboration with International Radiation Protection Association to fully examine, discuss, and debate the ethical basis of the system. Not only radiation professionals, but also ethicists and philosophers have participated in the workshops. This is the table of contents of the currently available version of draft report. At the beginning of the report, we try to explain how the ethical principles and values have been embedded in the evolution of the ICRP recommendations, together with the development of science and the accumulation of implementation experience. And the draft report addresses the core ethical values underpinning the system that have been identified through extensive discussions at the series of the workshop worldwide. Then the report has a section for procedural ethical values, which are related to practical implementation of the system. At this point, I wish to remind you that this is the first concerted effort by the Commission to reflect upon and describe the ethical basis of the system of radiological protection in some detail. And the report of the task group will be the founding document which illustrates this ethical basis. Now let me introduce the background in a historical context. After the system of radiological protection was born in 1928, ICRP has continuously further elaborated its recommendations, taking into account the scientific achievement in radiobiology and epidemiology, and the accumulated experience of the implementation of the recommendations, and the value judgment influenced by the change in societal and cultural attitudes. And it is worthwhile at this moment to note that it was already recognized in the middle of the 1950s by one of the co-founders of the ICRP and truly great Americans, Mr. Royston Taylor, that radiological protection is not only a matter for science, but also values. This ascertains that ICRP has been fully aware of the importance of ethical aspects in the evolution of the recommendations, though the ethical considerations are occasionally explicitly discussed in the publications. For example, in the 1928 recommendations, it reads, the dangers of overexposure can be avoided by the provision of adequate protection. The idea of the desire to avoid harm, which might be interpreted as non-maleficence, was already incorporated. The primary aim of the system is to contribute to an appropriate level of protection without unduly limiting the benefits through the management and control of radiation exposure so that deterministic effects are prevented and the risks of stochastic effects are reduced to the extent reasonably achievable. This could be interpreted in another way, that effects that can be prevented are prevented based on non-maleficence, and the effects where the risk cannot be prevented are managed through optimization of protection based primarily on beneficence and justice. And we can easily recognize that the ethical value of beneficence is implicitly embedded in the justification principle, since it is for doing more good than harm. The other two principles, such as principle of optimization for maximizing the margins of benefit over harm, and the principle of dose limit for avoiding inequitable outcomes of dose limit, for avoiding inequitable outcomes of optimization, can also be understood that they are based primarily on the ethical values of beneficence, justice, and equity. Since we know that we are now living in a more globalized world than ever, and ICLP is an international advisory body, it is certain that our endeavor to clarify the ethical foundations of the system should be grounded not only in Western ethical theories, but also on a study of the oral and written traditions which have been guided people in different cultures over the ages. One of my colleagues in TG94, Mr. Frida Georgia, will elaborate this point in detail in his presentation this afternoon. One example is the classical Confucianism. The fundamental standpoint of Confucianism is that the disposition of all humans is good and inclines to the good. Confucianism emphasizes the moral virtues in everyday life and teaches these 5 ethical values such as yin, wei, ye, ji, xin. Not surprisingly, we can easily see that the ethical values such as benevolence, justice, and prudence are the good examples of common values. One of the most widely applied frameworks in applied ethics is the biomedical ethics principles developed by Bucham and Childress in 1979. Their initial aim was to find principles that both utilitarian and deontologists could agree to without referring to a particular single theory of ethics, and came up with these 4 central values, such as respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. This system has been widely adapted in other areas, including public and environmental health ethics and technology assessment. As I mentioned before, through the deliberations of the series of workshops and other relevant meetings, the 4 cardinal ethical values underpinning the ICLP system of radiological protection have been identified. Namely, they are beneficence and non-maleficence, prudence, justice, and dignity. And from now on, I am going to discuss each of these a little more in detail. The values of beneficence and non-maleficence are closely related and are often combined in ethical frameworks. In the ethical context, the desire to do good is called beneficence, and the desire to do no harm is called non-maleficence. Beneficence is the action to promote the well-being of others. Do no harm is one of the demands of the Hippocratic Oath. ICLP system of radiological protection is to ensure that deterministic effects are prevented and the stochastic risk are reduced to the extent reasonably achievable. Therefore, aspects to consider under beneficence in a radiological protection context would include the direct health benefits from the reduction of exposure and the indirect benefits of applications involving radiation exposure, such as radiotherapy. However, some challenges are remained. In the system of radiological protection, it is inevitable to recognize that actions resulting in exposure could have the potential to cause harm, and the associated risk could have a certain distribution. Another key challenge for beneficence is how to measure the benefits, harms, and risks. Prudence is a form of wisdom about practical matters and actions. The critical point for this concept refers to the decision-making one has to make and the appropriate behavior one has to adopt without the full knowledge of the consequences. Prudence is the virtue of deliberation and judgment in order to make choices. This concept of prudence, introduced by Aristotle as pronesis, is a long tradition in ethics and is present in different cultures, including Buddhist tradition and Confucianism. The value of prudence is the cornerstone of the system of radiological protection, which is incorporated as L&T model and Alara principle. Prudence is related to uncertainty at low dose exposure. It allows to take into account the inevitable uncertainties of radiation science and to act judiciously and reasonably. Justice is an ethical value that directly relates to equity or fairness. And justice is a complex ethical value with meanings that cover three categories, and they are distributive justice, concerning fairness in the distribution of advantages and disadvantages among groups of people; restorative justice, concerning fairness in compensation for losses; and procedural justice, concerning fairness in the rules and procedures in the process of decision-making. In modern ages, this theory of justice has been well developed. Then, in the latter half of the 20th century, Rawls had developed the idea of justice in his political philosophy toward the directions of more protection of vulnerable populations. In the scientific context of radiological protection, a value of equity related to justice was first introduced in generating the idea of dose constraints for an individual. The idea of dose constraints is to optimize radiation dose in the range of acceptable risk for each individual. These dose constraints would be one of the instruments to achieve equity and justice in some planned conditions. It is generally considered unfair that one group may receive the benefits of a particular industrial practice while others bear the risk. The distribution of benefits and risks over space is not only issue for consideration under this ethical value, distribution over time are also relevant. In this respect, it is also important to consider balancing and trade-offs between living and future generations. Respect for human dignity forms the cornerstone of the Charter of the United Nations. Human dignity is closely related to ethical values of autonomy, which is defined as the capacity to choose freely for oneself and be able to direct one's own life. Respect for individual freedom and dignity is central in many ethical theories, including Kant's notion to treat individuals as subjects, not objects. In radiological protection, recognition of individual rights are commonly associated with those limits, namely to protect the rights of the individual not to be overexposed to an excessive level of harm, irrespective of consequences for society. But the values of dignity and autonomy are relevant to far more than those limitations. Issues cover the importance of workers' and patient consent, as well as the involvement of stakeholders in a variety of decisions related to radiological protection. Empowerment, which is creating autonomy, is deemed to be more important and has clear relevance for radiological protection measures. Example of this argument could include self-help measures and empathy for the people living in an accident and post-accident situations. For the practical implementation of the system, ICLP sets out a number of requirements relating to the procedural and organizational aspects of radiological protection. The procedural ethical values which underlie these requirements deserve to be highlighted because they are common to all exposure situations. They include accountability and transparency, stakeholder involvement, and reasonableness and tolerableness. And allow me to discuss each of these a little more in detail. Accountability can be defined as the procedural ethical value that people who are in charge to make decisions and must answer for their actions to all those who are likely to be affected positively as negatively by these actions. This definition refers directly to the ethics of responsibility, which states that everybody has to account for the foreseeable consequences of his actions. This concept of accountability as procedural ethical value is embedded in various ICLP publications, including publications 60 and 103. And the accountability of the present generation toward the future is explicitly mentioned in publications 77, 81, 91, and 122 related to waste management and protection of the environment. Transparency in relation to ethics refers to procedural justice and concerns the fairness of the process through which information is intentionally shared between individuals and organizations. It was not, however, until the 2000s that transparency became a general principle applicable not only to information about exposures and protection actions, but also on the decision-making processes concerning the choices of protective actions by policymakers. This notion of transparency as procedural ethical value is also embedded in publications 9 and 75 for radiation workers, and 62 and 105 for medical field, and also publications 60 and 103. Stakeholder involvement has become, in recent decades, an essential part of the ethical framework in private and public sector organizations. Inclusiveness is one of the essential procedural values with transparency and accountability to make ethical decisions in organizations. And the experience from Chernobyl and more recently Fukushima demonstrated that empowerment of affected people helps them to regain confidence, to understand the situations they are confronted with, and finally to make informed decisions to act accordingly. In other words, engaging stakeholders is a way to respect and, as in the case of post-accident situations, to help restore their dignity. Engaging stakeholders in radiological protection emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s in the context of the management of exposures in contaminated areas. And the stakeholder involvement was first introduced by ICLP in publication 82 in 1999 and became a requisite in publication 103 in relation with the principle of optimization of protection. The problem of deciding which actions are required to ensure that exposures are kept as low as reasonably achievable given the prevailing circumstances, and which level of risk can be considered as tolerable for the exposed individuals are central to the radiological protection system. And these procedural ethical values have evolved and are incorporated accordingly through the whole historical process of the evolution of the Commission's recommendations from the early 1950s till the 21st century. In practice, searching for reasonableness and tolerableness is a permanent questioning, which depends on the prevailing circumstances in order to act wisely based on accumulated knowledge and experience, namely with the desire to do more good than harm, to avoid unnecessary risk, to seek for fair distribution of exposures, and to treat people with respect. Another my colleague in TG94, Mr. Thierry Schneider, is going to further elaborate this point in the next presentation. In conclusion, based on the result of the review of the ICLP publications and the extensive discussions that have been made by TG94 and by a series of regional workshops, we can conclude that ICLP system is founded on the core ethical values of beneficence, non-maleficence, prudence, justice, and dignity. And these values are largely shared worldwide. I am sure that the report, which will be prepared by task group, will be the first concrete founding document for the ethical foundations of ICLP system of radiological protection, and will certainly help both experts and the public to gain a clearer view of the societal implications of ICLP recommendations and provide useful insights on the principles and philosophy of radiological protection, and thus help the dialogue between experts and citizens. Finally, this is the timetable for the publication of the report. Hopefully, the draft report shall be ready in early next year, and preliminary consultation will be made with very wide spectrum of audiences and stakeholders at ALPA 14 Congress in May next year. Then finalization of the report and public consultation will be made during some time in summer and autumn in 2016, and approval for publication by Main Commission of the ICLP is expected in spring 2017. Thank you very much for your attention.